So I'm still continuing to explore the nonlinear tools in Blender and just trying to understand kind of how they work and get through some of the information that's available. And unfortunately, it's still pretty limited. So I figured I'd share what I've figured out and what I've worked on in the hopes that someone out there is actually using Blender for animation and using these tools. But so far, it seems pretty limited. So hopefully this will let more people explore it and we'll get more people trying to improve the stuff. So I just started with a very simple armature. It's just the monkey head and a single bone, and skinned it. And then I started working on just creating some layers. So while there's not a direct animation layer concept like you would find in Maya and MotionBuilder, the NLA system, the tracks, do have the properties and work in a layered way. So the first thing I did was just start with the up-down movement. So if you see, I've got an up-down clip, and I'm going to hit tab with the base layer, the base clip selected. So you can see I have 3 keyframes, and then in the up-down clip, I've used the minimize this real quick. So the action clip has a three keyframes in it, and you can see over here that this is the animation on the joint. So it's just an up-down jump, and then I used the repeat action right here on the action clip itself to create a looped continuous cycle. The nice thing is Maya's clip editor in the time editor does the same thing, and in MotionBuilder you can do the same as well in the story tool, except that the MotionBuilder story tool has a issue that requires the clip to be saved outside the file in order for it to loop. So you know, plus one for Blender's NLA being equivalent for creating a looped clip to Maya, and besting MotionBuilder in this case. So I created the up-down cycle and then looped it. So I'm going to hit tab to go back in, and here you can see the other nice thing is that maybe nice, I don't know if it's nice, but it shows you what's actually in the animation and not the clip once you tab in there. So you can go in and edit the keyframes and everything, and you're seeing exactly what the keys are doing. They're not continuing to loop, although it might be nice if that was possible. And maybe there's a setting, I just couldn't find it. There are some settings down here, cycle strip time, which I'm not sure exactly what that does yet. And the documentation didn't describe a lot of how this stuff works, so I've just been trying to start with the simplest example. Okay, so I've got the bouncing monkey head here, and I did my up down, and so then the next thing I wanted to do was add another layer for forward translation. So in this case, this is an additive layer, and you can see that by I'm going to turn this on, and now he's going to jump forward. So if I grab this and hit tab, you can see that there's just a single, there are 2 keyframes, and it's just a linear interpolation forward. So if I hit pause and select here, you can see that my keyframes, I just have 2 keyframes, and it's a linear path to move the bounce forward. So I'm starting to layer this, and in this case the action is set to replace. Actually, sorry, animation data. It's active strip. Blending is additive. So this is the same as like an additional Maya animation layer with an additive key value. So one thing I've noticed is that the way Blender combines the NLA tracks, if it's set to replace, if there is no existing keyframe on a channel, then it just combines it down smoothly. It doesn't do additive, but If you set a keyframe on everything and you're in additive mode, then it will plus it. So if your base layer has a value of, say, 5, right, and then in your animation layer, you set a keyframe at a value of 3, then it's going to combine that up into 8, right? So that's going to be an additive value, base layer plus. If you set it to replace, then the top layer of 3 will be overriding the base layer of 5, and so then you end up with just 3. Which you see real clearly if you start keying in a relative replace mode and then switch it to add, and you have keyframes down here, then it's going to cause your animation to move further. So in this case, I created an additive strip, and it's not blending because I want it to be the whole length, and it's not cycling. So this is just a standard key. You can turn this off, and wherever it is when you turn it off, it's going to leave that value as is, and then you can turn it back on. You can also mute it, and when you mute it, it's different than deactivating it. So muting actually sets it back to the existing value. Turning this off leaves the value where it is. I would expect that to act the same, but they don't for some reason. Just, I guess, the way it's processed. So anyway, it's not consistent when I expected it to be. The star is solo, so here you can see that it's solo and muted. There we go. So if I solo a clip, again, no matter where you solo it, it doesn't show you the exact. Let me unsolo and set this low, and then I solo it. It's going to stay at that current value. So just be aware, your soloing is not going to actually show you only that animation. It's going to show you some mix of the current state of the graph, and then play it from there. So just that was causing me some confusion, and I kept getting inconsistent results until I actually realized what it was doing. So anyway, if you're like me, just be aware that, again, just like the muting doesn't create the exact quite end result as you expect if you disable here, soloing does the same thing. And again, that may be on purpose, or it just may be inconsistent and no one caught it. I'm not sure yet. The other thing to notice is that we've got locks on here, so you can lock the track from being changed, which is nice. And then one of the things that I originally didn't realize and was having trouble with is I needed to change the start time or adjust my clip. And so when you hit tab to go in here to edit it, there's a pin icon that isn't really visible when it's activated, but when you click in this area, it shows up. And that means that if you unpin it, you can change the start and end time. So I can change the start frame, and it leaves the keyframe in place. So if I undid that, if I turn the pin on and I change the start frame, now it's actually moving the keyframe, and it's pushing the other one off. And again, I didn't expect that either. I would expect that the clip would hold the end frame like the beginning does, but when you change the start, it pushes the animation away instead of compressing, versus the end frame not. So again, that's just an inconsistency I saw. But what I needed to do is change this so that it didn't mess with the actual key. So here you can kind of extend the clip without changing the timing, which is important. And that's the little pin icon. So just wanted to point that out because it was, again, something that wasn't intuitively obvious when I was exploring it. So okay, go back to the system here. I've got my forward action, and then I created another animation and created the clip. for scale. So now I've got a squash and stretch, and if you look at the scale, it's exactly the same as my up-down clip, except for it's only affecting the scale channels, and the scale is also additive. Now there's combine, subtract, multiply. Add is going to be the closest to a regular additive animation layer in Maya and MotionBuilder. Replace is going to be similar to the Maya and MotionBuilder animation layers when they are set to non-additive. Again, I use the cycle properties of the clip, and you can see I've got grab that. You can see that I've got the scale action right here that's just up and down to create this squash and stretch action. So I'll get out of that so you can see what's going on. I'm going to use the Alt, and on my trackpad, up and down, 2 fingers scrubs the timeline without a mouse wheel, so that's still at least nice. I can kind of scrub the same I could with the K key, or it's a jog-like ability. It's not a true jog like MotionBuilder, but it's similar to Maya, where you can hold the key down and just move through time without having to go to a timeline and click on it. So nice. I've seen it mentioned a few places, but it took me a minute to find it, so I figured I'd share it as well. So that's Alt, and on my keypad, trackpad on the laptop, it's double, 2 fingers up and down to scroll, like the scroll wheel on a mouse. All right, so here I've got the squash and stretch, and the timing's not too terrible. And so now I've got these additive tracks, and everything's combined. And now if I want to edit all these together and change the scale and the timing, I can move them. But when I click on it, even though they're all selected, if I click on them to try to drag it, they don't move together. So you hold the G key down, and you can move them all together. Or sorry, not hold it down, but hit G, just like translate here. So that's nice. Or you can use the meta strips, and you can create a group them into a let's see. Well, I'm not finding. I think Control G will group them as one meta. So now if I click on it and drag them, oh, it's still okay. Yeah, I guess, I don't know. The meta node stuff still doesn't work. But anyway, if you need to select and move all the tracks together, hold G down and move it, and it creates a temporary meta clip to organize them. I think it really is meant to work on several clips on one single layer and not across groups. So I've not found a way to kind of group them across and collapse this stuff down, because it kind of applies it to the, there's no dope sheet summary clip that I can find. The other thing to note is that you can change the order over here. So just like in Maya, you can change the order of how these clips are compiled together or added together. And that will obviously change the end result of the animation. Okay, so now I've had that, but everything's bouncing up and down, and I want to fade off or adjust the weight. And in Maya, or MotionBuilder, each layer has a animation weight. And in Blender, this is called animate influence. So under evaluation, down here at the bottom of the system, you'll find that there is a evaluation node, and then you have to turn on animate influence. And once you do that, then the influence slider becomes available, and this lets you change how much weight is being given to this animation as far as the composite. So here I just wanted to fade off the up-down movement as it got lower and lower to the ground without having to change my cycle. So I did an animate influence, and here you can see that that influence curve is right here. And the nice thing is you can leave it animated but turn that off, and the influence goes back to 1, so you can kind of see what it is without it. And then when you turn it on, you see that there's a line across the clip, and then that represents the curve that you've got for the interpolation. And the strip time, again, I haven't quite used this yet, and I'm not sure. I was just using the influence for this. Of course, you can also just not animate it and then change the influence itself. So if we came up here and set the influence to 50% or whatever, now it's not going to go as far. Although I think auto key, yeah, I may need to set a key for it once animation is on. Let's see. Keyframe. Interesting. There we go. I just had an extra keyframe that was changing my timeline there. Okay, so now you can see that we can alter the animation and kind of play with all these settings individually, which is really nice, and that's one of the things that makes nonlinear animation really cool. It becomes really powerful. And then the last part of this where I've hit a problem is still the animation baking. So in Maya and in MotionBuilder, baking animation down happens really quickly, and it applies to everything in the scene, and it's fairly straightforward. And one of the things I'm still having a hard time with is getting this to work correctly in Blender. Before I jump to bake, let's just look at one more setting on here, and this is something that's really kind of cool. Again, you can change the overall speed or the scale of the clip to compress it in time, which is nice. So you can change or slow things down as a whole clip. But under here, this hold nothing or hold forward, if you need an action to just take place for one section of the animation and you don't want the clip to affect the whole system, then you can set this to nothing. For example, if I move the scale over here and I come back, you're going to see that it stays scaled and the head is squished until it starts playing the animation again. So if I change this to nothing, you can see that there's now no yellow line coming off of, or no shading coming off of the end of the clip, and you have no scale until you hit this part, and then it starts scaling again. You can also tell it to just hold forward. So again, if we start scaling, and now we want it to continue with the last scale value, or whatever the last value of this clip is, we can change this to hold forward, and it's going to now hold and keep the scale. So it's a nice set of options for how to change the what happens before and after the clip. And then of course you can set this to nothing, and it's going to just turn on and turn off, but that's where you can use the blend in and blend out. And so if you change the blend in and blend out, you can see that there are a couple settings showing up, these little gray curves on the clip. And so now it's going to blend into the action and start, and then it's going to fade off. So now it doesn't scale weird at the end, and that's actually what I want. I want it to jump, and then when he lands it squishes and does squash and stretch with my scale animation, and then it fades off. Because if I didn't have this on, it might still be staying scaled. So we can blend the clip, which is really cool. Okay, so that covers most of the stuff that I've just been exploring and playing with this simple action scene. And let's see if there's anything else that jumped out while we're talking about it. Okay, so those are the main things. Just changing again the active strip. This, if I scale this over a little bit, extrapolation set to hold, which goes both forward and backwards, but then you can still blend it in and out if you need to. Right now I'm just going to do set it to nothing. And then it blends in and bounces and blends out. Okay, so let's talk about the baking. As I said, baking, once you get all these tracks layered and you want to basically cook all this animation down, baking inside of Blender exists in pose mode. So if you're in object mode, there's not really a way to get to it that I know of. Bake action, oh, there is. So bake action here, you can get to it, or in pose, either way. I've been in pose mode, and we go to pose, and under animation, bake action. So it should go to the same place, I believe. Object, animation, bake. Okay, so we have the bake action window. Two things I've noticed. One, it doesn't remember what settings you used last time, which is really frustrating because if you want to just bake it and you're always baking to a set number of frames, and you use a certain number of settings, let's say I want this on, override the current action, which also doesn't completely display, and I don't think there's a way to adjust this window popover. So let's say I do all that, I close it, I go back and back to animation, bake action, and everything is default back to where it was before. So it would be really, really great if this could remember how you, what settings you were. By default, it's only selected bones. I'm going to turn that off because I don't want to have to select anything. And I've been in the NLA track, so here you can also see if stuff disappears, that is set to only selected. So here you can see all of the actions that exist inside the scene. If I select there, then it shows back up. Okay, so we go to Object, Animation, Bake Action, and turn off only selected bones. Set this to like 90. Visual keying is supposed to bake a transform with constraints. I don't have any constraints, so I'm not going to turn this on. Remove all constraints from keyed objects. I haven't seen this actually work. I've done a basic test with having constraints, and I turned on visual keying and clear constraints, and in Maya this would basically deactivate the constraints, and then here it says it's supposed to get rid of the constraints from the keyed objects, but I couldn't get that to actually, it didn't seem to work. Clear parents, I'm guessing this would bake an animation and then unparent it, but again, I'm not sure. And the other thing to note is that if you have an object or a pose, so if you have you can't bake the two things together. So anything that's at an object level of animation, which would be a global transform on the armature itself, for example. If we go to item, you know, moving and rotating the armature itself is an object level transform, and so now you know that can be animated, but it doesn't bake. Or when you're at the pose level, which is what you've posed on the armature bones, we have that ability to bake the animation. The only thing I do notice is when you're in pose mode, at least the default's to bake data pose versus object. So it tries to tell you you're going to bake the animation on the bones, and it doesn't seem to let you combine both. I can't select both at the same time. Oh, wait a second. Well, that's interesting. I never tried holding shift down, so maybe that does work. All right, I'll have to try that again later. But right now I just want to bake the pose, which is where all the animation is, and I would like to combine all these to a new action. So right now I'll set this to 90 and turn off selected bones and set pose and hit OK. And so it does a really fast job of baking the action. And you think that this works because it looks like there are a lot of keyframes here. But if I go ahead and come back here and I turn off my tracks, you can see that in this case the bake action only baked 2 of the clips. It did not combine with the last action for some reason. And so if I turn that into an action clip, I can turn this back on, and now I get the same results visually, but I could not get these to all bake together. So the solution for now is you have to go to File, Export FBX, and if we allow the FBX exporter to bake the animation and key all the objects and force all this stuff out, that will cook all the animation down, and then you can load the FBX back in and create the action clip and then copy it over. But I couldn't seem to, within Blender itself, get the bake action to work. So that's where I'm at with all this. I'm liking some parts of the nonlinear tools. There's certain things that are definitely really powerful and that work well. There are some things that are not quite as intuitive as I would expect them to be, or just some inconsistencies again between what I would expect Solo to do versus what muting the clip does. A couple other things that I've noticed when I try to create a new action, if I go ahead and just add a new, if I just go to select him and move something in keyframe, on this animation data, by default the action comes in as set to replace, and if I change this to add, it doesn't seem to change the key value. So if I go ahead and go back to my keyframe and scoot this up, insert location. Okay, let's see if that actually did it this time. Okay, so if we look at the value here, T, location, root bone, amplitude, frame value. Okay, so my value is set to 2, and the clip is set to add mode, and we can see the influence of that setting. When I combine this down into a new track and clip, okay, it did stick. Okay, I was having inconsistencies with this, in not recording that. So again, just make sure that if you're going to create a new animation, when you click on the action animation, set this to additive if you know you're going to do additive animation, and then when you hit your keyframe, it should be setting values based on an additive mode. So here you can see that this value is now set at a much lower value because this is now correctly accepting the current translation plus whatever additional value I've added, and that way you keep an actual correct constraint. It does do a pretty good job of with combine. Combine seems to mix these two, and from what I was reading, it seemed like this was designed to kind of properly mix this stuff down, but still allow this individual track to work on its own, kind of like an additive, almost like a normalization mode in like skin weighting. So I'm still trying to figure out exactly how that works. So from, like I said, I would love someone to explain this to me, but when it's set to combine, the end result animation looks like an additive animation, but it's using the kind of final result value. I'm still trying to figure that out. But from the manual, it seemed like it would be cool if that was the case, so that you could have a kind of a composite action that means this clip will take the final values of everything and give the correct key pose value, but still mix the systems. But again, I'm not sure on that. So, all right, that's kind of where I'm at with Blender nonlinear tools. I'm stuck with baking. I'm not sure how to do that without using FBX. There's some inconsistencies in the tools that I've found just to be able to control the mix and just making sure that your blending mode is set before you go in and start keyframing can be important, because changing it after is difficult. Like if we change the scale to multiply after we've done the animation, it's going to be a different action than. Well, now it doesn't seem to. I'm not sure what it's doing at the moment. Usually when I change that, it is an obvious change of scale. But anyway, I hope that helps out some people that are looking at this coming from MotionBuilder and Maya, and also hopefully a Blender user will see this and give me some feedback or information on how to improve this this workflow. And thanks everybody. Have fun.